Let's get started for this evening's presentation as part of the Wisconsin Center for Wildlife Spring Colloquium Speaker Series. In a second, I'll introduce today's esteemed speaker, Dr. Heath Agee. But before I do that, I have a few announcements to make. First of all, keep in mind this is the third of 5 seminars for the semester. We have 2 remaining after this. Next week, Kent Van Horn will be here talking about his experiences as the migratory waterfowl biologist for the state of Wisconsin, and he's actually going to be talking about the third component of the North American Waterfowl Management Plan, which would be the social side, the people side of things. If you remember, Mitch and Lisa talked about populations. Heath's going to talk about habitat. Ken's going to talk about people and social values and human dimensions. So really looking forward to that. And then Dr. Kaminsky is going to give the keynote presentation on March 30th, the week after spring break. So two great speakers yet to come, and looking forward to those, and hopefully we can make that. The other 2 more announcements. The Wisconsin Waterfowl Hunters Conference is this Saturday at Hotel Mead in Wisconsin Rapids. Is that right, Mr. Landon? Yep. So if you haven't had a chance to register, you can register the day of, or I believe you can still register by emails.
Well, you could do that, or you could come and register.
Right at this point, come to the day of. There'll be a table. But great opportunity, a lot of good speakers, a great keynote speaker that will be there. And that is going to be this Saturday at Hotel Mead in Wisconsin Rapids. Okay. And then the last announcement I'll make before the introduction, the UW-SP's chapter of Ducks Unlimited they will have their student banquet, which is Thursday, March 30th. If you'd like to purchase tickets for that, Brandon Johnson is here today. Raise your hand, Brandon. He's going to be out in the reception after this, and you could purchase tickets from him. Or raise your hand if you could. Other members that are here could buy from anyone here. I don't know if there's some system of points you get for selling tickets, but I don't want to just single out Brandon. Anyways, that's March 30th. We're really excited about that event, and hopefully you can come to that. Okay, so without further ado, I'll introduce Dr. Heath Agee. Heath did his undergraduate degree at Southern Nazarene University in Oklahoma, his master's degree studying blackbirds at North Dakota State, and then his PhD at Mississippi State University. Shortly after that, he did a postdoc at University of Tennessee. And then he's currently the director of the Forbes Biological Research Station, Illinois Natural History Survey, for about a month more, and he's taking a new position, a brand new position actually. He's working for the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service as their waterfowl ecologist for the whole southeast region, where he'll be a liaison and kind of a director level position for science and management for over 120 national wildlife refuges from Virginia, the Carolinas, all the way to Louisiana. So really exciting new position for him. Last thing I'll say is Heath and I got to know each other first as PhD students at Mississippi State, and Heath really kind of, when I was a new student, he brought me into the team. The team was called Team Duck, and I wore the shirt today in honor of Heath.
Should have worn mine.
Yeah, you still. There's a group of us around the country now that were Team Duck alums. So Heath's been a good friend of mine, and I'm really excited to bring him to campus here. So please welcome Heath Agee to the. So take it away, Heath.
Thank you, Jake. Really appreciate the opportunity to be here today and to give a little presentation on important waterfowl habitats throughout the Mississippi Flyway and be part of this lecture series for the endowed chair position. Really excited that Jake was able to come here and that the position now exists, and like I said, just happy to be here today and probably get to know some of you a little bit later during the social. As Jake mentioned, I work for the Illinois Natural History Survey. The Natural History Survey is sort of a all research or mostly research branch of the University of Illinois. So I'm a University of Illinois employee. I'm not a faculty member, sort of like a all researcher, but I do teach classes a little bit, have graduate students, interact with undergraduate students, so on and so forth. So am at least tangentially kind of in the education world as well. Some of you, of course, will be coming down to the Forbes Biological Station to our facilities and participate in some SCOP and dabbling duck banding as part of Jake's field experience class here in a week or two. So look forward to having you there for that. If you've never heard of the Forbes Biological Station, I thought I'd give you a little bit of perspective. So we're just your neighbor to the south in Illinois, of course. We are along the Forbes Biological Station is located on Chautauqua National Wildlife Refuge along the Illinois River. The lower Illinois River along this stretch is a historic channel, an old channel of the Mississippi River. So we have a lot of habitat. In fact, that channel is actually much older, much more sinuous, and we have a lot more backwaters in the current channel of the Mississippi River. So it's a really neat place. A lot of waterfowl habitat, and we have millions of waterfowl, especially dabbling ducks, that stop by during spring and fall migration, which makes it a really neat place to study waterfowl. And I'm really fortunate to have been the director there since 2012. So there's a picture of the Forbes Biological Station with Chautauqua National Wildlife Refuge in the background. Right out our back door is a spring-fed creek, and then on the other side of the levee is the South Pool of Chautauqua National Wildlife Refuge. That's really neat because it's a massive moist soil unit. When the river cooperates and we can get it drawn down, or the refuge manager can get it drawn down, it's an area that can hold a couple 100,000 ducks during peak migration on any one day during the fall. So it's a really neat place to be, to see that many birds and to have an area that provides that much wildlife. And of course, it's a great place to do research and to be a waterfowl ecologist. There are a couple of famous people that have been at the Forbes Biological Station before me. You might have heard of Frank Belrose, who we call the father of wood duck management, was really a pioneer in waterfowl ecology, waterfowl research, and in broader field of migratory bird research, doing some of the first radar research on migratory birds, waterfowl, and others. Wrote a couple of influential books, including Ducks, Geese, and Swans, revised Ducks, Geese, and Swans, which until just a couple of years ago still served as the best source, the best reference available for waterfowl information really in the world. After Frank was at the Forbes Station, Frank was there from the late 1930s all the way through the 1980s, there a long time. And then Steve Havera was director from around the mid-1980s until the early 2000s. And Steve wrote the book that many of you, I think, are using for the course, Waterfowl of Illinois, which is a really nice text and does a lot to contribute to the waterfowl really knowledge in the Midwest, so not just Illinois. I usually show my picture up there, but I haven't had time to write a really cool book yet, so it's kind of anticlimactic, so I decided not to show it today. All right, so we're going to talk a little bit about wildlife habitat, so I thought it worthwhile that we at least pick a definition of habitat and talk about it today. There are certainly many different versions or definitions of habitat, and in the scientific literature it can actually be a fairly contentious issue, how you define habitat and whether or not something is a vegetation community or it's a component of a habitat or whether it is habitat. In some of the classic definitions, we think about habitat as all of the things that are used by an organism throughout their annual cycle or throughout a year. That's maybe not such a big thing to get your head around if you're thinking about an insect or something that doesn't live very long or has a home range that can be measured in meters or feet or even miles throughout the entire year. But when you try to think about a migratory bird that may travel thousands and thousands of miles in a year and may travel across dozens of jurisdictions and international borders and things, the word habitat can take on a whole different meaning and really have a lot of implications behind it. And so for waterfowl, when we think about habitat, we have to think about it at a scale that is quite massive. So just to influence you there and to get your minds thinking about that. I pulled out a couple of components of habitat that I think are important and that I'll focus on in this conversation today relative to migratory waterfowl in the Mississippi Flyway, where we of course find ourselves today. food being the first one, and this is going to vary tremendously across all of the different species. This, for instance, is food that came out of a lesser scaup that we collected a couple of years ago, actually up here in Wisconsin. I believe on Pool 7 is where this bird was collected. So lots of invertebrates, lots of gastropods, some bivalves, and a variety of other things that this bird was eating. But if we think about a different season, this scaup could have been eating seeds in a different season, or maybe nectonic invertebrates if they were available in other areas, like if it went to the prairie pothole region after it left the Mississippi River. And so food is something that varies tremendously across all of the species, and even within a species or within an individual across the different time periods. But nonetheless is a very important component of habitat, and something as managers that we have to pay attention to, and as researchers have to research what kinds of food are best for a bird and what kinds of food comprise quality habitat or high quality habitat. The other one that I chose, or another one that I chose, would be cover, and by cover I also mean space. So birds, migratory birds, have to just have, you know, cover for nesting, for example, or they have to have space to exist, open water bodies in which to forage in or which to rest in. They've got to have some physical things around them, be that vegetation communities or open water, some physical structure, and that also, of course, can vary throughout the annual cycle and among species. For instance, we could have diving ducks that use these massive reservoirs throughout large components of their migratory time period or wintering time period. We can also have things like secretive marsh birds, although not waterfowl, but critters that pretty much only use emergent vegetation, and so they're going to have much more limited areas that they can exist in, compared to something like a mallard, who's a generalist species, and they may find themselves at home sometimes in a Walmart parking lot or a subdivision or a cornfield, much more plastic in their use of areas and different habitats. So we have to worry about all those different things as habitat managers. And this is a big one, and I'll talk about this a little later because it's something that's really interesting to me right now, and that's sanctuary. That would be a component of habitat that's away from humans, and not just humans, but away from disturbance. So they've got to have time to carry out their life functions, not only feeding and nesting, but also just being safe. For instance, in the fall and winter when we have hunting season going on, sanctuary is a big deal. Birds have to have time to get away and space to get away from disturbances so that they can survive long enough to go back to the breeding grounds and recruit into the next generation, produce young. And of course, this happens at a very large scale. So this figure, Jake probably covered this in his first presentation, I presume, is out of the North American Waterfowl Management Plan. These are important, in North America, these are important locations for waterfowl and important habitats. We're not going to go through this, but I am going to use it as a backdrop today, just to get you thinking about the scale at which we have to worry about habitat and think about habitat in the Mississippi Flyway. In general, of course, the breeding grounds for most of our waterfowl species are in the north. Migration grounds are sort of in the middle, and wintering grounds are in the south. That, of course, varies among species. There are certainly exceptions to the rule, such as wood ducks. We generally think about Wisconsin, southern Wisconsin, as maybe a migratory area, but we do have mallards that breed here, wood ducks that breed here, and a few other species. Illinois is the same way. We do have some important breeding habitats, but mainly a migration area, just like a lot of these other areas that are kind of in the mid-continent. In the Mississippi Alluvial Valley and Gulf Coast, coast of Mexico and other Central American countries, those are wintering areas. Birds are primarily there for 90 to 120 days during the wintering period, and survival and sanctuary are a big deal there. In the middle states, we're thinking more about sanctuary during the fall, food during the spring, and then in the northern areas, of course, breeding habitat, which would be things like grass and wetlands and a few other things. So as we move from north to south, of course, although of course there's a lot of variation, we do see different food bases. So those may be things that are important to think about as a manager. So things like amphipods or other nectonic invertebrates may be very important during the breeding and brood rearing season because the birds require a lot of protein. In mid-continent areas, especially in the fall, we have a lot of agriculture, and birds that are equipped to do this may field feed and use lots of agricultural areas, or in the south, they even flood agricultural areas to make that food available. When we get further into the wintering grounds, natural wetlands are very important, where we have less waste grain because temperatures are warmer, growing seasons are longer. Agricultural crops get harvested earlier, and so there's less waste grain available, and so natural wetlands are very important. Coastal marshes, moist soil managed areas, those in national wildlife refuges and those on private lands, and then just vast areas of coastal marshes throughout wintering ranges, of course, very important. And again, just generally speaking. When we think about cover, that also varies by the season and by latitude. We have lots of our, especially dabbling ducks, that use vast prairie areas of central Canada and the northern U.S., North and South Dakota, and in eastern Montana for breeding areas. The prairie pothole region is an area that's very important, and we're looking for small wetlands, seasonal wetlands, temporary wetlands associated with large tracts of grassland. In mid-migration areas, often reservoirs are important. Of course, here in the Midwest, we've lost most of our wetlands, and we'll talk about that in a minute. And so riverine systems become very important because they're some of the only wetland areas that are flooded and available on a regular basis. Things like pools pools 7, 8, 9 of the Mississippi River, the Central Illinois River, Pool 19 of the Mississippi River, portions of the Ohio River, in these mid-migration areas, portions of the Missouri River. Those are very important habitats because there are little wetlands associated with those, and also those are available annually to the birds, and they're in major migration areas. And then when we get further south, a variety of different wetlands, of course, become available, and this cover is important. Different types of cover is important. So forested wetlands for wood ducks, mallards, black ducks, and a variety of species become very important. Not only green tree reservoirs, but also naturally flooded forested wetlands. Coastal marshes, I've mentioned them a couple of times. They're very important for a variety of species. So as you can see, the cover changes as we go throughout the seasons and throughout this flyway. So managing for these on a large scale as part of the North American Waterfowl Management Plan becomes challenging because we have all these different things, the seasonality to worry about. Transitioning over to sanctuary. Sanctuary, of course, very important in the winter when there are hunters on the landscape and when disturbances may be high. But we can also think about sanctuary in terms of breeding habitat, areas for birds to get away from people and away from other predators to carry out their annual life history events like breeding, brood rearing, post-breeding, molting. All of these activities are very important. This is an example just of a wood duck box. A number of years ago, in the mid-20th century, cavities were limiting across most of the Midwest. We'd lost a lot of our old growth tree species, as many of you may know. We had some young forests, some regenerating forests, but not a lot of cavities produced. And so the wood duck box program became incredibly important in the mid and late 20th century, something that may be a little bit less important now because we've had our forests are getting older and we have more natural cavities on the landscape now. Also during spring and fall migrations, some large areas, loafing areas such as agricultural fields or these large reservoirs may be important, not just to ducks but geese. Same thing on the wintering grounds. National wildlife refuges, as you get farther south, become very important because of all the hunting pressure along the flyways and in wintering areas. So national wildlife refuges tend to provide this sanctuary area where there's not a lot of human disturbance or limited human disturbance, and those become very important as you get farther south. Not that they're not important in northern areas, but for that sanctuary portion of habitat or sanctuary component, particularly important in the southern United States and at southern latitudes. All right. If we think about these, in particular, these breeding habitats, the boreal forest is very important for some species in portions of northern Canada. Area of lots of trees, lots of small wetlands. not incredibly productive in terms of primary productivity, but incredibly important for a variety of species. In the central prairies and North and South Dakota and northern U.S., central Canada, and a variety of other places, large grasslands, as I mentioned earlier, are very important. These large tracts. This is large tracts of grasslands, undisturbed, without farming or any other issues, with lots of these small wetlands that dry up every year. Those are incredibly productive places, produce a lot of invertebrates, so those become very important for breeding habitat for lots of our dabbling ducks and some of other diving ducks. As I mentioned earlier, this is Pool 9 of the Mississippi River. These large pools and river systems in the Midwest become incredibly important during the migration period because it's habitat that tends to be there year after year. It's not these little farmed wetlands that may be there one year and not there the next. They also are stabilized, especially in northern areas, and still maintain submerged aquatic vegetation. SAV is a very important food item for a bunch of really neat waterfowl species. Some of our swans, canvasbacks, eat Vallisneria tubers, gadwall, widgeon, redhead. Lots of our species that are important and some that are of major conservation concern really depend on SAV communities and these big pools of the Mississippi and Illinois River and other areas in mid-migration latitude. And then I've mentioned coastal marshes a couple of times. As you get further south, a lot of birds depend on saltwater areas, coastal marshes, brackish areas for habitat in the wintering ground. So that becomes an incredibly important component. The variety of different species, I thought I would just mention those that we see in the Mississippi Flyway that depend on all these habitats. And as hopefully soon to be waterfowl managers or waterfowl habitat managers that are going to be contributing and following the North American Waterfowl Management Plan, you may be thinking about lots of these different critters and the requirements that they have at different latitudes. For instance, we have subarctic breeding and temperate breeding Canada geese. So many of the geese that were harvested in Wisconsin up to just a few years ago, for instance, would have been produced in areas in the subarctic around Hudson Bay and St. James Bay and other areas. So they would have produced there and come here during the fall and winter to be harvested. We have a burgeoning temperate breeding population. So I'm not sure what the statistics are for Wisconsin, but in Illinois our harvest is getting close to 50-50, where we have birds we call MVP birds coming from subarctic areas versus birds that are produced locally, these temperate breeding birds. People think of them as park geese, but they're not just park geese. We have literally hundreds of thousands of geese in many of our Midwestern states that are produced annually and contribute significantly to waterfowl harvest in the fall. Also a species, if you think about even a more extreme example, snow geese and Arctic breeding geese that breed even further north and over a huge geographic area, and those birds will come through and use the Midwest as migration area and go all the way to East Texas and Louisiana and coastal areas, go to Arkansas and even places farther south to spend their winter. So an incredible variety. In the eastern part of the Flyway, black ducks are an important critter to manage for, and they're very dependent on forested wetlands, for example, throughout their annual cycle. In the western part of the Flyway, pintail become a little bit more common and a little bit more important, and they're going to like more seasonal wetlands, very open areas, larger bodies of water, because they have a little bit different habitat preferences or cover preferences, so different things to think about there. We have difference in migration timing, so some of these birds will come through the area very quickly and at early times of the year, such as things like a blue-winged teal. They're going to come through and migrate through the area in the fall in September, so they're going to be one of the first birds to migrate south and be one of the last birds to migrate back north. And so when we think about providing habitat, providing water on the landscape, you got to think about a mallard maybe that may not get here, may not migrate through until December, but also something like blue-winged teal that may be gone by the middle of September. So that's a lot of variation in the timing for water on the landscape and managing wetlands. And the same thing during spring migration. Some of our earliest species are going to begin coming through this area right now in late February and early March. Canvasbacks may have already moved mostly move through some portions of the Mississippi River. Certainly there's a lot that have already moved through Pool 19 and maybe at this latitude and farther north now, whereas blue-winged teal may not be here until April in large numbers. So there's a lot of variation in those. And of course I couldn't show a slide, I didn't want to, but I couldn't show a slide without mentioning the mallard simply because of numbers. We have a lot of other critters or a lot of other waterfowl we have to pay attention to that make up this variation, but mallards are very important just because they're so numerous. Breeding populations of over 10 million birds in the mid-continent in the U.S. So those are very important, again, just because of numbers and importance to our waterfowl hunting community. And we couldn't do a habitat presentation without, unfortunately, talking about all the habitat that we've lost in the Midwest, in the Corn Belt and the agricultural desert, as some would call it, as far as habitat for wetland birds, wetland-associated birds. As you can see, the red here would be the central portion of the United States, what I'm calling the Midwest, and that's an area of extreme wetland loss. In portions, for instance, of Illinois, we've lost well over 90% of the wetlands in certain ecoregions, mainly to row crop agriculture. Some to development, but mostly to row crop agriculture, which now is in mostly corn and soybeans. Wisconsin is faring a little bit better, but birds are going to have to come through this bottleneck right through this area where we've lost a ton of our habitats on their way south and on their way back north. Just to think about it in terms of numbers here, and this is a little bit old, so the numbers may be different, but some of our states in the middle of the Mississippi Flyway, wetland loss rates well above 80%. And so we have a dramatically less habitat than we used to have, and so managing habitat strategically to make sure that we have the right kinds of habitat and enough habitat when we need it is important and is a central component of the North American Waterfowl Management Plan, as you probably heard from previous speakers. So habitat's very important, if for nothing else, because we've lost most of what we have for waterfowl, because not all birds will feed in a cornfield, and as you get further south, there aren't very many resources left in the cornfields, for instance, when birds need them, especially during spring migration. Now I've got just some slides, and this is some Illinois River stuff, just to give you an example of how effectively we have, I'll call it, re-engineered the environment, really messed up some of our natural resources and changed some of these areas that used to be incredibly important to waterfowl. Luckily, some still are, but they are highly degraded as far as habitat quality. So for instance, this slide is from the upper Illinois River. Around 1900, so the turn of the century, major modifications were done to the hydrology of the Illinois River. Remember, I said this is an area that can sometimes hold hundreds of thousands of birds during peak migration, peak fall migration through the area. And unfortunately, the city of Chicago experienced massive population growth, and they began to have a sewage problem, an effluent problem. They were basically putting their waste into Lake Michigan and then bringing their water right back out of Lake Michigan. I won't go into the details, but that became an issue very quickly. So they decided they would send all their waste, a variety of different kinds of waste and things, down the Illinois River. The issue with that was that their watershed did not flow down the Illinois River. Their watershed flowed toward Lake Michigan. So there's a little bit of a ridge here if you're not familiar with this. So all the water, so this is where present-day Chicago, well, that would be this whole area. But present-day Chicago concentration downtown would be this area, and so everything was flowing to Lake Michigan. Well, we have the Des Plaines and the Kankakee here, which form the upper portions of the Illinois River, and so they decided they would just send all of their, they would just re-engineer the river, essentially, bring water out of Lake Michigan and send everything down the Illinois. The reason I point this out is because it's an example of the crazy things that we've done to change our environment, and it's not just about the Illinois River. We've done this to other major systems. We've messed with most of our major rivers in the Midwest, and they all have stories that are kind of similar to this. So after what we call the diversion, water levels were raised, shipping canals were dug, and water then flowed essentially backwards in the watershed down the Illinois River, which changed the ecology of the Illinois River forever. You have these massive engineering projects that went on again around the turn of the century, where we dug canals, we changed the flowage of some of the rivers and rerouted the rivers. We constructed dams, constructed weirs, major sorts of engineering, which actually at the time is pretty amazing that they were able to do this through what is now present-day Chicago. Of course, that was again to move effluent, to move sewage, to move a variety of things down the Illinois River, which is going to change the water quality. It's going to change the nutrient content. It's going to change base water levels. A variety of different issues were secondary effects of changing the way water flowed through this watershed. For instance, locks and dams. Locks and dams can even create more waterfowl habitat, more wetland area in the short term. Like on the Mississippi, actually, there are areas where locks and dams have created more habitat and probably benefited birds in some areas, but it's sort of a short-term solution because stabilizing water levels doesn't really bode well long term because of issues from sedimentation and you're not able to draw the down. You kind of pause and stop that wetland or lake cycle, and you don't have that change going on. For some of the students in the class, I know you've seen this figure a couple of times. Not only did we change the hydrology in the river, but we also changed the physical form. Again, this has been done in a lot of rivers across the Midwest, where we implemented what are called drainage and levee districts. Essentially, you put up a big levee right on the historic levee of the river, or the high point right next to the river, the bar. You drain everything behind it, and then you get these drainage and levee districts in the background, which look something like this, so you can farm them. Of course, it's highly productive soil, but what you do is you don't allow that water to get to the floodplain. So there aren't these temporary wetlands when ducks might be going through the area. Floodwaters can't reach that floodplain. You don't have the nutrient cycling. You also constrict the river so that water flows can flow faster through the watershed, which can create issues downstream. All of these changes also change the hydrology. Here's an example of the Illinois River at Havana, where the Forbes Biological Station is located. And this is a hydrograph, so not to point out these individual things in too much detail, but this is time a month on the x-axis and river stage, so water level on the y-axis. The orange line is what the historic hydrology would be. We'd have a major spring flood, a low time in late summer, and relatively stable. The hydrology now actually does this a lot more, but after all these changes were basically completed to the Illinois River in the 20s and 30s, this is what happened. We have the river raised several feet, so different areas of the floodplain are now always inundated. We also we added variation in some points and took away variation others, so that throughout the growing season there are a lot of these variations, these ups and downs, where we had a relatively low and constant river level before all of these changes went in. And so you have an issue with not being able to grow vegetation, because water levels that go up and down are going to kill the vegetation inside the river area. We still have the spring flood, but it's lower magnitude, and we never get the summer low water, unfortunately. So you stop the wetland cycle, and that reduces the habitat quality for waterfowl. So you get something that looks a little bit more like this, where you had these former backwater lakes that would have dried out, and old river channels where the river would move around, and now it's all stabilized. We have these large agricultural levees and these backwater lakes that are very stagnant, very shallow, very sediment filled because of all the changes that we've done in the hydrology. And again, that's an example from the Illinois River, but that's happened to all of our rivers, many of our rivers across the Midwest. I mentioned sedimentation a minute ago. That's not something that you measure in our area in inches or millimeters. It's something you measure in people. So this is the parking lot. This is this parking lot, which is along the river near Havana, and this is after just a couple of weeks at flood stage. You can see the water's going back down, and that's more than a foot of sediment that's been deposited in that parking lot. This happens every time the river floods, so you can imagine the amount of sediment that comes down the river. And this is not some big, huge eddy where, you know, all the sediment in the huge stretch is dumped in one area. The whole river looks like this after we have a flood. The amount of sediment that comes down the river is incredible, and it fills up backwater lakes. It degrades the habitat quality, requires dredging, requires lots of expense from the Army Corps of Engineers to re-engineer that. Here's an example where we had the sedimentation in process. This is actually, we're losing a backwater lake. So here's an area, this is Quiver Lake in 1930, and around 1980, you can see that backwater lake is nearly gone. This is where there's a little bit of an eddy effect in the river. These are actually trees growing on that now, and the area is completely reforested now. So we've gone from a backwater lake that was filled with SAV about 80 to 90 years ago to now not only an area that's shallow and filled with sediment, that actually is a very low quality bottomland forest, mostly willows and cottonwoods and silver maples that can survive that area. We've also lost a lot of our SAV, or submerged aquatic vegetation, and aquatic vegetation, as I mentioned earlier, because of the dramatic change, because of the sedimentation for one thing, but also the dramatic changes in water levels during the growing season. So this is an example of a joint venture funded project that was done as part of some efforts under the North American Waterfowl Management Plan to identify some assumptions and identify some issues with waterfowl habitat in the Mississippi Flyway. So Frank Belrose in the 1940s, 50s, and early 1960s had gone out, and by hand he had mapped all these vegetation communities in dozens of backwater lakes along the Illinois River. So what we did is we took these old maps, and they're huge maps, and we digitized them electronically in ArcMap, and went out and remapped the same areas in 2005 and 2006, and you can see the change. Where we basically documented what I've been talking about, where we had all these diverse aquatic vegetation communities that now are basically open water areas, sediment filled, very low quality for waterfowl. I know I'm concentrating a lot on the Illinois River, but this habitat degradation is something that is happening up and down the Mississippi Flyway. Gulf Coast, for instance, this is projected land loss. So all this will be coastal areas and coastal marsh that'll all be probably gone by 2050. And this is just a little area around New Orleans, but that's a common theme throughout all of the coastal areas, from sea level rise and the loss of sedimentation, land subsidence, and a variety of other issues. Basically, our engineering of the landscape without allowing the landscape to adapt and flow and rivers and habitat to flow naturally and do things as it would have. Just some pictures of that, and some of our attempts to mimic what was there. Although the sustainability of some of the things that we try is limited in nature, just because we're kind of putting a Band-Aid on the things that we can't fix in the long term. But we do our best. Again, not just in the Midwest, but in other areas, we're losing prairie at an alarming rate. Because we've lost the ability to disincentivize this with some agriculture policy and farm bill policy that's changed over the last 30 years or so. So people are plowing up prairie, draining these temporary wetlands. The Conservation Reserve Program is something that in the last 30 years or so has been a great thing for ducks. Literally millions of ducks are produced every year and enter the fall flight because of the Conservation Reserve Program through NRCS and the USDA. However, we're losing CRP acres at an alarming rate, and in the worst possible place. That's the duck factory of North America here in the northern U.S. And central Canada, and that's of course where the northern U.S. is where we're losing most of that CRP acreage. Those grasslands that used to be highly erodible and marginal farm ground that went into grass. So that was a little depressing, and I'm sorry, but it is the truth. We have limited habitat, and we need a lot of help, but we need to do it in a strategic way, and so that's where the North American Waterfowl Management Plan comes in. So I'll say the sky was falling. I don't know if that's accurate or not. I think the sky might be falling, but I wanted to be a little bit more positive in the slide. So again, Jake probably talked about this, so I don't want to go into too much detail, but the North American Waterfowl Management Plan established joint ventures. We're in the Upper Miss Upper Mississippi River and Great Lakes Region joint venture here in the Midwest. And so this is a conservation plan that was formulated in 2007. And the reason that we have this step-down process is so that we can produce maps and target areas for restoration and protection, so we can protect these waterfowl habitats that hopefully that you guys now believe are very important and very in peril. We can then take those joint venture, large-scale conservation plans and step them down to state level. For instance, again, this is Illinois, but this is from the Illinois, essentially what is the State Wildlife Action Plan, and this has targeted areas, again, step down from that national strategy, North American Waterfowl Management Plan, or international strategy, down to the state level, so that we protect what are the most important areas to protect, these target ecoregions that we know are most important to waterfowl. So, North American Waterfowl Management Plan in action. Let me tell you a couple of things that are bonuses. So one thing where we've had some habitat gains in the last 30 years have been through conservation programs like Wetlands Reserve Program. Now it's called the Wetland Reserve Easements. But the Wetland Reserve Program has protected hundreds of thousands of acres, probably millions of acres by now, across North America, and a lot in the Central and Mississippi Flyway, where it's very important, and we have a lot of our waterfowl in North America concentrate in this area. Also CRP, I mentioned that we'd had a lot of loss of the Conservation Reserve Program, or these grasslands that are important, but we do have a lot of CRP in the Central and Mississippi Flyways that are important, not only the breeding waterfowl, but these areas support waterfowl habitat through different practices throughout the flyway. I mentioned national wildlife refuges earlier, so that's just not, so those are important for food and cover in the northern portions, but very, very important in the fall and mid-continent areas for sanctuary, and in southern areas of the U.S. for sanctuary during winter periods when hunting seasons are open. Those are incredibly important as well. What about restoration? So I could talk about, so those are some habitat gains or some areas where restoration has happened on a large scale, but I thought I might also just take a couple of minutes, and I'm almost done, but take a couple of minutes and tell you about Imaquan Preserve, which is a very specific example of the North American Waterfowl Management Plan, at least indirectly in action, where we had this strategy, this effort to conserve habitat and restore habitat internationally, that's all gone on, that then trickles down to a local area. So we see these, so we know that it's important in the region, and those regional plans are stepped down to the state of Illinois, and then conservation partners like the Nature Conservancy and the Illinois Department of Natural Resources take that information, take those priority areas, and they do something about it. They acquire land and they restore something that we've lost. And that's what happened with the Nature Conservancy at Imaquan Preserve. So this is a classic drainage and levee district. There's the Illinois River. This used to be a massive floodplain of the Illinois River, now very productive agricultural area. The Nature Conservancy was able to acquire almost this entire drainage and levee district around 2000, and in 2006 started restoration of the area. And so this would be an example of restoring the cover. So they left this big drainage and levee district levee, so they left the river levee in place. Remember I said the Illinois River, crazy hydrology during the growing season makes growth of aquatic vegetation an issue, lots of sedimentation issues. So they kept the river out, which is an issue because of some areas. So there are some benefits, some function values from floodplains that we get. So we didn't get those back, but the waterfowl habitat produced was phenomenal. And so from 2007, that area basically was a flooded farm field. By 2013, we got this amazing area full of aquatic vegetation. This white and green hash mark area is floating leaf and submerged aquatic vegetation zone, and that is something that we've pretty much lost almost 100% of from the Illinois River Valley. And so we see hundreds of thousands of birds, including almost 200,000 coots on some counts, using just Imaquan Preserve. So I heard some coot hunters out there earlier. So for those of you, this would kind of like be your Mecca waterfowl spot. Apparently you need to stop by. So cover. So we've restored some cover in mid-migration areas, and we do have breeding waterfowl and water birds and marsh birds and things that use that as well. We've done a couple of projects where we've looked at this SAV community, measured the food abundance, and there are literally millions of duck energy days produced by that aquatic vegetation community. It is competitive, and maybe even produces more food on a per hectare basis as moist soil. It's an incredibly productive system when you get these aquatic bed wetlands, these emergent marsh communities where they're producing lots of SAV like sago pondweed or Vallisneria or coontail or even Myriophyllum. Those are very valuable waterfowl species, waterfowl food species, and those which have been largely lost from the area. And of course, sanctuary. So sanctuary is very important. Imaquan is located in central Illinois, so a mid-migration area, really important during the fall, and they do provide some sanctuary. The Nature Conservancy during this process came to us and said, hey, we want to provide some sanctuary. We think 50% sounds good. Can you tell us how many hunters we can have on our area, how many bird watchers? Can you tell us how to do the human use? And I kind of looked at them and said, no. I don't know. How do you do that? How do you tell if an area is 50% sanctuary or 40% sanctuary or 25%? There's not a great way to do that. So we did a little project where we tried to evaluate that and tried to kind of quantify the sanctuary area. And so just to tell you just to illustrate what I'm talking about, sanctuary is really not one discrete thing. It really is a continuum of disturbance. And so at one end of the disturbance spectrum is no sanctuary. There's disturbance all the time from humans or other wildlife or bird watchers or hunters or whatever, right? There's a lot of disturbance. And then at one end there's spatial sanctuary where nobody goes in there. It's maybe there is some natural predators, but humans stay completely out of there. And so that's spatial sanctuary. It's completely off limits. Somewhere in the middle is where a lot of our waterfowl habitat exists, with some kind of temporal sanctuary. It's sanctuary sometimes. People go in there sometimes, but not other times. And so that's where we live a lot of times, but who knows where that 50% really lies and how do you quantify that? And that's something we came up with a little project to work on. It's also not the whole area, because if you think about this as a wetland area, right near the buffer, there may be some disturbance. So even though you have this total, this 1,000 acres of wetland, all of it might not be sanctuary, high quality habitat. There's some kind of buffer zone where you'll have some disturbance and you won't have that whole area to be sanctuary, but nobody really knows how big that buffer is. To make it even more complicated, we also have a little bit of research that tells us that it varies between species and by disturbance, and maybe even with individuals. So really hard to predict what that, it was going to be really difficult to pick out like real species of duck, so I did some cartoons, so excuse that, sorry about that. But anyway, point is there's a different buffer. That disturbance buffer differs between different species and between different disturbances. So you have bird watchers or one bird watcher or horde of bird watchers, or somebody doing something crazy in a vehicle, some kind of disturbance, or somebody boating. All of these species are going to respond differently to that. We do have some research that tells us that, so it makes it very complicated. So we decided to not do individual experiments where we would go try to disturb the birds. We would monitor the number of hunters, the distribution of birds, and try to get at that experiment a little bit naturally. So we have an aerial survey program. I'll spare you the details, but we have an experienced aerial observer named Aaron Yetter. He counts lots of ducks. We did some transects so that we could get spatially explicit locations, bird locations and bird numbers and different combinations of species. We did some iterations and some analysis in ArcMap to turn that into thunderstorm maps or heat maps, if you will, where we know that large concentrations were. We then turned those into rasters so we could quantify that. And then we looked at how these areas compared to the areas where we knew we had disturbances from hunting. These were hunting disturbances, for instance. And then we were able to quantify that over an entire hunting season to get a better idea of this buffer zone and exclusion zone. Exclusion zone being virtually no birds in this area. There's some distance where absolutely is no habitat around where somebody is hunting or somebody has just made a disturbance. Buffer zone, it's reduced quality compared to an area where there's no effects or no detectable effects of bird distribution. And what we figured out over this process, which I'm being very general about right now, is that for all dabbling duck species, this exclusion zone was relatively small, just 30 or 40 meters, but this decreased area of habitat quality was quite a bit larger, up around 200 or above 200 meters. So every time you have a disturbance, it's not just that little area, it's hundreds of meters around that area that are going to be affected for some period of time. And that varied by different bird guild, looking at just our dabbling ducks, our non-mallard dabbling ducks, and then mallards by themselves. So different combinations of that, we had different answers or different amounts of sanctuary provided. But overall, we were able to tell the Nature Conservancy that approximately 50% of their area under their hunting program turned out to be in this red or this sanctuary area, which, as it turns out, was about what they wanted. So they really liked our research. We just kind of lucked into that one. If I'd have told them it was only 10%, I don't know what we'd have done. I guess they'd have asked us to do the research again or something. But I'll point out that on places like Imaquan Preserve, one thing we also found was it's not just these guys. It's also researchers, the fisheries researchers, the fishermen, the water quality researchers. Everyone has these disturbances, and they all have a little bit different effects. So anyway, that's just an example of identifying some of these components of habitat that are important to manage under the North American Waterfowl Management Plan, and all the different ways that you can be involved in that. Hopefully, to set up Kent for next time, I thought I'd mention the people component, because that project leads into the people component, and that's incredibly important in the updated North American Waterfowl Management Plan. So we've got to think about bird watchers, we've got to think about hunters, we've got to think about people's opportunities. So it's not just about where the ducks are and what the waterfowl populations are doing. It's about much more than that going forward, and we have very little information on that. We're just getting our head around some of the biological things and the biology of birds and how they respond and how much food they have and all these other components. And now we're switching it up with the new North American Waterfowl Management Plan to really focus on people. And so it's a challenge that I guess is going to keep Jake and I in business for a long time, we hope. So that's all I have. I'll be happy to take any questions if we have time.
Thank you.
Yes, sir.
Yeah, there's time for questions.
Could I ask a question? You had that on the screen. It seemed to me you were saying that if you got disturbance at 33, whatever, it extended out much further than that. I don't think I understood what you were saying. Could you tell me again what you meant, what you were saying?
Yeah. So for that particular example, and that was the overall dabbling duck community, I think was that very top one. What we found was that exclusion zone, so around a hunting disturbance, we would detect no water birds for about 33 meters in a circle around there on average. That was the average exclusion zone distance, which doesn't sound that bad, right? And that in fact it was a little smaller than what I thought it would be. But that buffer of disturbance would extend much farther than that. And that would be over 200 meters, where there would be birds, but they would be at lower densities than we would expect if there were no disturbance there. And we had to set thresholds. We had to figure out how many birds and what densities of birds represented no disturbance. And so we had days with hunting and days without hunting and a variety of other things. So the point being, if you have a hunting disturbance, one single hunting disturbance, it's a circle with a diameter of 400 or 500 meters at minimum, and for some species that are more sensitive to disturbance, it may be thousands of meters, is that diameter of that circle, where it's lower quality habitat, so that's not technically spatial sanctuary. Yes, there are birds there, but they're lower densities than we would expect if there were no effects of hunting.
Thank you. I'm going to take what you told me, and I'm going to apply it to a piece of property, let's say I own 500 acres, 100 or whatever, and I let somebody hunt. See, I only hunt on the weekend.
Mm-hmm.
I let a couple of guys come in and hunt on Wednesday and Thursday. That couple of guys that are hunting in one spot can disturb the entire area, the whole 100 or 500 acres, so that when I come on the weekend, my opportunity is reduced as a result of my generosity by leaving these.
Those guys aren't in this room. I got to know how I'm going to answer this question.
These guys aren't coming back.
Uh-oh, I got him in trouble.
I could apply this to trespassers.
Yes.
And
Yeah.
so, if I had that, the best thing for my interest is keep everybody the hell off of it. You have students in here.
Sure.
And I can't keep my mouth shut, but I've been hunting ducks for a long time. And I can't tell you how many arguments and fights I've had with other duck hunters. And public land versus private land, and just a whole bunch of it. And what you're saying to me is the less duck hunters, the better off I am as a duck hunter.
With some
But,
caveats.
see, that defeats the purpose of the whole program. The purpose of the program is to get more people and get more money. So I don't see any solution.
So that's a large conversation. It's an excellent question and observation. I will say we didn't have any harvest data in here, so I can't comment on the individual harvest. It might or might not affect the harvest. But as far as densities of birds, the more disturbances you have, certainly the larger those buffer distances get. And what I didn't have in here either were time lags. But after you have a disturbance, there is a very significant time lag. And so the general answer is after you hunt somewhere, for that to return to pre-hunt conditions, you really should measure that in weeks and not days. Now, I'm not saying you can't still shoot 6 birds there. We don't have the data on that. But there is some research that really sanctuary area and inviolate spatial sanctuary should not be measured in days of no disturbance. It should be measured in weeks of no disturbance. We do have some information there. But again, in a migration area, you have new birds coming in, so they're naive, and so that may break down a little bit, whereas in other areas it wouldn't. An excellent question, and I don't have a great suggestion for you, and I don't want to cost people their hunting opportunity, because that's important, right? We want to recruit hunters, and so we may lose some opportunity, but we may have higher populations because we've recruited more people into the system. They put more conservation dollars in there. We have more habitat indirectly. So we think there may be some benefits from recruiting people into the waterfowl hunting community, into the conservation community, but that feedback loop is very hard to measure, and it's something we're trying to grapple with.
I could get into some real comments here because come Saturday there's going to be a group of people that are going to have a meeting, and these guys are duck hunters. And we have some arguments in the past, unless I believe it's 30, got an early teal season. And not only that, but we've also got a youth season. Now, those opportunities are not fully appreciated by all duck hunters. And some of what you're saying is supports perhaps that position that an early youth season is not any good for duck hunting by some people. And the teal season, which is early. Because both of these create disturbances. Big disturbances in some areas. And what you just told me is that those areas won't recover from that disturbance in a week. It's going to be a month. Well, now let's go back to when the deer or duck season is established. Hell, you got 30 days of duck season gone before this is even beginning to recover. So that you could expect better hunting. Because you established youth hunt and you established an early teal season. Or at least that's how I'm thinking.
You're going to have some, especially you're going to have some turnover of birds, which is going to confound that. So you'll have some renewal of birds, and so that might not be, especially from teal season to regular duck season, there would be a break. So you might not, so it might not be the case. Also, there is a threshold, but we don't know exactly where that threshold is. That threshold where, you know, a couple of disturbances or minor disturbances probably won't affect it very much. But once you get past that threshold, there are major changes, and that may affect it for a long time. See, it's very complicated, and we don't have very much research on it. I wish I had better answers for you, but I don't. And again, we didn't have any harvest data, and there's not very much available. Yeah, so I'd love to have harvest data to go with this. Next week.
Let's bring this up with Kent next week.
Yeah.
We should invite Keith to our meeting on Saturday. But I think in the interest of some other questions, I think, Ellen, do you have, I'm sorry, good question.
Yeah, great question though.
Keith, can you go
Yes,
to
ma'am.
the big picture of the restoration of the...
Imaquan? Mm-hmm.
You can see that better than I can. The first picture that shows it starting.
Too many cartoon ducks. This one? Mm-hmm.
Yes. So it was purchased in 2007.
It was purchased in 2000, I think in 2000, but they didn't do anything for a few years.
2007.
Mm-hmm. 2007 was the first year where water was allowed back on the landscape in the floodplain.
Now, this is from 2013.
Mm-hmm. And it looks very much the same today.
So when will it be drawn down drastically to make it look new again?
Excellent question. So I didn't know we were going to that detail, and so I just said something that I'm going to take back now. It looks a little bit different than it does today because we're entering the wetland cycle. With this as a wetland again, and it's been approximately 10 years or so since this wetland was reestablished, and so we're actually now beginning to have, so we've had relatively stable conditions for 10 years, so we're having diebacks now in the emergent, especially the emergent community and SAV community, and the open water here, the blue is really expanding, and so it is time for a drawdown. And to answer your question, they just installed a massive water control structure and have begun the process of drawdown, but it's a very large place, and so it'll take a long time, but they do have infrastructure now to begin to draw it down to reset it.
And are you hearing, or will they hear comments about, you can't draw that down, it's the best duck hunting I've had in 10 years?
They hear
Draw
an amazing number of comments. That's an understatement. Technically, it doesn't matter what any of the comments are. This is the Nature Conservancy's property. It's essentially a private, or managed like a private wetland, just like a private landowner could, so they can do whatever they want. They do allow public hunting, as I showed, as a service, and public fishing, but they don't have to do that. And so there have been significant controversies in the community with the drawdown, and to convince the public that, yes, you'll lose some opportunity, but if we don't draw this down, the whole place is going to begin to decline, and it's going to look like the backwater lakes like everywhere else looks like, because we don't have a cycle. We aren't reinitiating that wetland cycle. We have to have at least a partial dry phase. So that has been a significant controversy in the region with fisheries and with duck hunters. But I would say fisheries is one of the, they manage a co-op fishery with a DNR, and you know, if they do a significant drawdown, they'll probably kill some fish, and that'll be a significant issue. Did I answer your question?
Where can we find out more about that?
There's a website called Experience Imaquan. I think it's experienceimaquan.com. Or if you Google Imaquan Preserve.
PNC owns all of it.
They are. Yes, they own it all. Mhm.
Okay, thank you.
Rachel?
I had a question. So I love this example
Uh-huh.
as a successful restoration project. There's a nice paper
Mhm.
I read today, Hein et al. 2016 about this.
That was an author on that, yeah.
Yeah. And so what I was wondering, we've been talking about big scale restoration, especially in the Mississippi Mississippi River Valley. How and can this be used as a template for other areas in the Mississippi River? Like how big scale could this go?
I would love to see 20 Imaquans all along the Illinois River, and I would love to see them along other major systems. How realistic is that? I don't know. I don't know all the particulars, but to buy, to buy 5,000 to 7,000 acres of very expensive corn ground in central Illinois is challenging. I think the purchase number was 15 million or more, I think. I mean, it was a big purchase. And the reason that the Nature Conservancy was able to do it, as I understand, is that there was only one landowner in a big chunk of this, or most of this, so it was a continuous track. If you had 20 or 30 different landowners in something that size, I mean, purchasing the whole thing would be almost impossible, and you couldn't, you couldn't restore the hydrology unless you had the whole thing purchased. So this was a little bit of a unique situation where they were able to do that. So I don't know. I'm sure they could do more, but it would be more challenging than this situation. As far as whether or not they should, I would love to see them do that. One thing that also has been controversial, as I mentioned, is that river levee that from the ag levee is still in place. So there's virtually no exchange of water coming back and forth. One of the reasons for that is this has been cut off from the Illinois River since 1920. The river now sits higher than the floodplain because of all the sedimentation that has happened in the river. If you were to break that, eventually sediment would pile up in the floodplain, but you would have a lake there that you could almost never draw down. It would be an issue because the floodplain is so much lower because we haven't had any buildup of sediment. So we've created a weird problem there. And for the time being, for waterfowl habitat quality, keeping it disconnected is best for these aquatic vegetation and communities and for ducks. But of course, we don't get any of the flood control and other things that we would with a natural floodplain and that process.
Would you be able to drain it?
They cannot gravity drain the entire thing. They can gravity drain it. I don't remember. It's more than what this figure shows. They can gravity drain a significant portion of it, at which point even at the lowest river flow during summer low water levels, it's going to equal out. They still can't get it past the bottom of that control structure, and so they have pumps in place, and they can pump it out the rest of the way if they want to really draw it down. It's expensive, of course, but they can do it if they decide to do that. Did I answer your question, Rachel? Yeah. It's a neat area. It's not feasible in most areas, but just the sheer lack of all that, the loss of basically all the aquatic vegetation from the lower Mississippi River and from almost the entire Illinois River makes this really, really important. I mean, thousands and thousands of gadwall are here in the spring and fall, and canvasbacks and redheads and other aquatic vegetation kind of specialists that really don't occur in other areas. We've seen local booms in population of pintail and gadwall and a few other things that really use this type of habitat or this type of wetland type that we didn't see before. Yes, ma'am.
So kind of just the opposite of that question, how small could you do that would still have a positive impact on waterfowl or emerging vegetation or something?
It's a good question. You could certainly benefit a few ducks from something very small, less than an acre. But as far as impacting waterfowl populations, I think we're talking about changing management of rivers, before we would do something like that in non-breeding areas, which brings us back to the North American Waterfowl Management Plan and the joint venture. The Nature Conservancy on its own is not going to be able to do that because they'll do smaller projects. This is a massive, very expensive project and takes a lot of funds annually just to keep up. But even people doing smaller projects, they can't do a lot on their own. But through this strategy with the Upper Miss joint venture, you know, and all these conservation partners, all these partnerships that we have, and through this strategic process, which Jake talked about in the first lecture, we're able to do the science we need to, and do the strategic habitat conservation and this conservation planning process, so that, you know, over 20 years or 30 years or however long it may take, we may have a bunch of these on the landscape, or improvement, more large-scale improvements that may be more impactful on a population scale. I think I pretty much dodged your question, but did I do that okay?
Yeah. So I work with the easement program, and so
Okay.
kind of thinking about it in that regard,
Yeah.
how small does it make sense to spend money on a wetland restoration, you know, versus having impact in the area versus, you know, how big should we go? I mean, kind of comes down to priority of funds to what's going to have the biggest impact. So, I mean, how small can we go if somebody's willing to do it?
You asked me the question again. You're not supposed to do that after I dodge it effectively.
Maybe a life raft. I mean, those, like in this case, these large restorations, like you said, are, you know, migration habitat
Right.
for populations. But some of those small ones, I mean, in the breeding areas,
Mhm.
those small wetlands can be locally
Mhm.
important for a lot of different
Mhm.
birds.
Mhm.
And even a few acres can make a difference for
Right.
brood habitat.
Right.
And so let's say you do 2-3 acre wetland restoration. Okay, but that might not be a big deal, but you get 10, 12 other of those, and you start building these up around, that stuff can make a difference
Yeah.
to birds, and it's been shown to do that, so.
And if we get away from waterfowl, I mean, they're an interesting critter, because they use these huge geographic annual ranges. But if we think about other things, you know, anurans, or, you know, herps in general, those sorts of things, you know, those little bitty wetlands can make a huge difference locally. So certainly, like Jake said, or for breeding waterfowl, really important. But as far as, you know, migration habitat, you know, the large scale and some kind of large planning process is really, I think, where we're all going, and is something we work to, because it's got to be millions of acre scale, right, overall, to really make a difference.
So I think, let's thank Dr. Hagee again.